The troubled birth of the Hawker Typhoon. When the Hawker Typhoon roared onto IAF airfields in September 1941, it carried the full weight of Britain's desperate hopes. The Air Ministry urgently needed a fighter fast enough to catch the Luftwaffe's brutal new Focke-Wulf FW-190, a machine that had been humiliating Spitfires over the Channel since its debut that summer. Sidney Cam's design team at Hawker pinned those hopes on one element: the monstrous Napier Sabre engine, a 24-cylinder powerhouse generating over 2,000 horsepower. On paper, it promised 400 miles per hour at altitude and the muscle to reclaim Europe's skies. But reality was far crueler. The Typhoon quickly revealed itself as a flying death trap, nearly destroying its own squadrons before it ever downed a single enemy. Within weeks, pilots were reporting catastrophic failures. The Sabre overheated, seized mid-flight, and sometimes shattered under stress. Connecting rods burst through the engine block, spraying burning oil across cockpit canopies. Worse still, the Typhoon's tail had an unnerving habit of breaking clean off during dives, sending aircraft spiraling apart at high speed. Between September 1941 and May 1942, dozens of Typhoons disintegrated in mid-air. Squadron leader Dennis Crowler-Milling watched 2 of his men die this way within a fortnight, their aircraft breaking apart over the fields of Lincolnshire. Then came an even more insidious killer, carbon monoxide. Exhaust fumes leaked into the cockpit through the engine cowling, silently poisoning pilots. Many returned from missions pale and shaking, with pounding headaches and blurred vision they blamed on fatigue. Several lost consciousness mid-flight. Flight Lieutenant Robert Beaumont nearly died in November 1941 when he blacked out at 15,000 feet, saved only by his navigator's frantic efforts to rouse him. Once medical officers traced the cause, Hawker's engineers were forced to redesign cowling panels completely. But with factories already overstretched, implementing these fixes proved agonizingly slow. By early 1942, morale was at rock bottom. Pilots called the Typhoon the murderer and begged for transfers. Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas seriously considered scrapping the project altogether. Britain had sunk millions into a fighter that was killing its own men faster than it killed Germans. Yet there were no alternatives. The Westland Whirlwind had already failed, and without the Typhoon, the IAF had nothing to match the FW-190 for another year. One man refused to give up. Roland Beaumont, now commanding 609 Squadron, insisted that beneath the chaos lay a fundamentally sound machine. The problems, he argued, were mechanical, not fatal. Beaumont personally flew countless test missions, documenting every fault and sending meticulous reports to Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory. His persistence convinced the Air Ministry to give the Typhoon one last chance, a final improvement program that would determine its fate. Hawker's engineers worked through the brutal winter of 1941-42, racing against time. The tail failures came first. Investigations showed that the joint between the fuselage and tailplanes simply wasn't strong enough for the Typhoon's immense aerodynamic forces. Engineers reinforced it with 12 new fish plates and heavier aluminum stringers, retrofitting existing planes and grounding entire squadrons while fitters installed the upgrades. It crippled operational capacity, but it worked. After March 1942, tail failures vanished almost overnight. The engine, however, remained a nightmare. Napier had rushed the Sabre into service before adequate testing. Its revolutionary sleeve valve system warped under heat, causing engines to seize. Ernest Chatterton, Napier's chief engineer, introduced tighter tolerances and new high-temperature lubricants. The fixes reduced, but didn't end the failures. Pilots learned to fly with extreme care, watching temperature gauges like hawks and never pushing the throttle for too long. The carbon monoxide issue was resolved with simpler but life-saving solutions: rubber seals around the engine cowling, better cockpit ventilation to maintain positive pressure, and primitive chemical detectors that change color in the presence of carbon monoxide. These small improvements saved lives and restored a fragile sense of trust among Typhoon crews. By mid-1942, Typhoon squadrons were flying again, mostly defensive patrols along Britain's southern coast. But as an interceptor, it was still a disappointment. The Sabre lost power above 20,000 feet, and the Typhoon's thick wing created drag that crippled its climb. The FW-190s could simply dive away before the British pilots could react. Squadron leader Dennis Gillam lamented that his men flew the fastest fighter at low altitude, and the least useful one in the air war that mattered. Then, By chance, the Typhoon found its true destiny. During anti-shipping missions that summer, pilots discovered its raw power at low altitude. The 420mm Hispano cannons tore through ships and convoys, and the Sabre engine thrived in the dense air near sea level. Skimming the waves at 400 miles per hour, Typhoons became predators, striking fast and vanishing before enemy fighters could react. These impromptu rhubarb raids proved devastating. By November 1942, the nightmare was finally easing. The tail stayed intact, the engines held together, and the cockpits were safe. The Typhoon would never dominate at high altitude, but it had become something far more dangerous, a low-level ground attack beast that would soon spear the Allies' assault across Europe. From failed fighter to ground attack legend. By early 1943, it was clear that the Hawker Typhoon would never rule the high skies. Designed as a high-altitude interceptor, it was now finding an entirely different destiny, one that would turn Britain's most problematic aircraft into Germany's worst nightmare on the ground. The Air Ministry's acceptance of this truth came slowly and unwillingly, but reality left no room for illusions. Comparative tests of the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, pitting the Typhoon against captured Focke-Wulf 190s, confirmed what frontline pilots already knew. Above 18,000 feet, the German fighter outclimbed, outturned, and outgunned the Typhoon in every possible way. Its thick wing, a blessing for stability at low level, created immense drag at altitude, while the Sabre's supercharger gasped for air in the thinning atmosphere. Yet, as fighter command searched for purpose, tactical circumstances provided an unexpected opportunity. By late 1942, German tip-and-run raid had intensified, FW-190s streaking across the Channel barely above the waves, dropping 500-pound bombs on coastal towns before British defenses could react. Radar couldn't see aircraft flying below 500 feet, and standard interceptors were too slow to catch raiders racing home to France. Suddenly, the Typhoon's brute speed at sea level became invaluable. At 2,000 feet, it could hold 380 miles per hour, fast enough to run down the German attackers during their escape. Number 609 Squadron pioneered new interception tactics in January 1943, patrolling likely approach corridors. On January 20th, Wing Commander Roland Beaumont scored the squadron's first low-level kill, downing an FW 195 miles off Calais with a short, 3-second burst that sent it spiraling into the Channel. Within weeks, other Typhoon units adopted similar methods, positioning along the coast, launching on radar alerts, and timing their turns to strike as the enemy withdrew. By March, the Luftwaffe low-altitude raiders realized their immunity was gone, and such attacks dwindled sharply. Fighter Command, encouraged, expanded the Typhoon's offensive role. The aircraft was unleashed on Ranger missions, armed reconnaissance sweeps across occupied France, hunting trains, trucks, barges, and troop columns. The Typhoon's quartet of 20mm Hispano cannons proved devastating. A 2-second burst hurled 90 explosive shells, enough to shred metal, masonry, and men alike. Pilots learned to aim for locomotive boilers, where cannon fire would pierce the thin plating and trigger massive steam explosions, disabling entire trains. By spring 1943, the German army dreaded the Typhoon's approach. Soldiers in northern France described the Sabre's ferocious growl as a deep, angry buzz, like a giant bumblebee. It could be heard minutes before the aircraft appeared, but rarely soon enough to escape. Flying at barely 300 feet, Typhoons use hedgerows and ridgelines for cover, erupting into view only seconds before their attack runs. German radio transmissions capture the panic in their voices. References to Jabos and later Tiefflieger, low-flying demons that struck without warning and vanished before flak crews could react. By June 1943, 18 Typhoon squadrons stretched from Cornwall to Norfolk, the largest single-type force under fighter command. The aircraft had finally found its purpose, not through planning but through battlefield improvisation. Yet its evolution was far from over. The deadliest chapter, one that would turn it into a tank buster, was already being written. That transformation began with a 3-inch rocket projectile, a weapon born from Britain's naval laboratories. Originally devised to help convoy escorts destroy surface U-boats, the RP-3 measured 6 feet long, weighed 60 pounds, and used a solid cordite motor that burned for 2 seconds before coasting ballistically. It carried either a 60-pound high-explosive warhead or a 25-pound armor-piercing head. Engineers at the Ministry of Aircraft Production quickly realized the potential for ground attack aviation. A single Typhoon, armed with 8 rockets, could unleash a broadside equal to that of a naval cruiser. Trials began in August 1943 at Predannock, Cornwall, using modified Typhoon fitted with 8 underwing rails. Test pilot Bill Humble conducted the first live firing on August 13th, diving at 30 degrees from 2,000 yards. The rocket flew true, though accuracy was inconsistent, affected by speed, dive angle, and air density. Pilots would need new skills entirely, mastering a kind of instinctive rocketry where feel mattered more than gun sights. Squadron leader Dennis Gillam's 184 Squadron received the first operational rocket-armed Typhoons that October. Their mission: develop attack tactics before large-scale deployment. Gillam's team quickly learned that rockets demanded a whole new approach. Cannon strafes favored long, shallow dives and extended bursts. Rockets required steep, precise attacks, 45 degrees or more, to flatten their trajectory and ensure penetration. The critical factor was pull-out altitude. Too high, and the rockets lost power. Too low, and the pilot risked being engulfed in his own explosion. Gillam set the minimum release height at 1,500 feet, giving barely 3 seconds to recover before impact. Early combat tests revealed that the rocket's greatest strength was not only its destructive force, but its terror. German troops who had grown accustomed to artillery and bombing had no defense against the shrieking RP-3. The rockets tore through the air with an unearthly howl, followed by concussive blasts that shattered eardrums and ruptured lungs even when they missed. A direct hit vaporized vehicles, leaving only craters and twisted fragments. In some cases, post-strike reconnaissance couldn't even identify what had been destroyed. By January 1944, 6 Typhoon squadrons had completed rocket conversion, dedicating nearly all training hours to perfecting these attacks. The newly formed 2nd Tactical Air Force, created to support the coming invasion of France, designated them as its main anti-army units. Allied planners knew that German panzer divisions would pose the gravest threat once the invasion began. Traditional bombing lacked the precision to stop mobile armor, and cannon fire barely scratched their plates. But the RP-3, with its armor-piercing warhead capable of penetrating 75 millimeters of steel, offered a solution. It could destroy almost any German tank, from Panzer IVs to even Tigers, if it struck from above on the turret or engine deck. Skeptics in Bomber Command doubted that fighter pilots could ever achieve the precision needed to hit such small, moving targets. But those doubts would vanish soon enough. Britain's most disastrous fighter was about to earn a new title, the Scourge of German Armor, D-Day and the Typhoon's reign of terror. Skeptics had reason to doubt. Training reports confirmed that even veteran pilots rarely landed more than 30% of their rockets within 50 yards of a stationary target under perfect test conditions. Combat, with its chaos of smoke, fire, and flak, could only worsen accuracy. Yet the Typhoon's rocket payload was the only weapon capable of responding fast enough to the demands of mobile warfare. Artillery required hours to reposition and depended on observer networks. Heavy bombers were too blunt an instrument, devastating but imprecise in fluid frontline battles. The Typhoon offered something revolutionary, the power to deliver devastating fire anywhere within 100 miles, and to do so within 20 minutes of a request. When dawn broke on June 6, 1944, and Allied troops surged toward Normandy's beaches, Typhoon squadrons were already in the air. While American paratroopers fought for St. Miguel's, 36 Typhoons from No. 83 Group swept over the channel, tasked with silencing German artillery shelling Utah Beach. Flight Lieutenant John Baldwin led the charge. Diving through scattered cloud at 7,000 feet, he rolled into a 40-degree attack on reinforced bunkers 3 miles inland. The rocket struck with brutal precision, smashing positions that had shrugged off hours of naval bombardment. In 4 minutes, his formation loosed 9 to 6 rockets, turning a fortified ridge into a smoldering wasteland. The German reply was immediate and deadly. Well-prepared flak batteries, hidden among hedgerows and villages, opened up with everything from quadruple 20mm cannons to the dreaded 88s. Typhoons diving at 2,000 feet made perfect targets, forced through dense fire zones where a single hit meant death. On June 7th, Flying Officer Peter Brooker's Typhoon was struck during his pullout over Korean, disintegrating in midair as his horrified wingmen watched from above. By the end of D-Day, the 2nd Tactical Air Force had lost 9 Typhoons to ground fire and seen 14 more so damaged they required major overhauls. The real challenge, however, emerged immediately, finding the enemy. Normandy's tangled hedgerows, narrow lanes, and dense copses concealed entire Panzer formations. The Luftwaffe had been swept from the skies, but German commanders adapted by mastering concealment. Tanks moved only at night, parking under trees and camouflage netting before dawn. Pilots scoured the countryside from 5,000 feet, seeing only fields and silence. "We flew for hours over Normandy," wrote Flight Lieutenant Pierre Klosterman, "carrying enough firepower to wipe out a Panzer battalion, yet we never saw a single target." Necessity bred innovation. Forward air controllers, RAF officers embedded with advancing infantry, began relaying coordinates directly to circling Typhoon units. Using a coded grid system, they could summon airstrikes within minutes. Typhoons, operating under the new cab rank system, orbited at 10,000 feet awaiting calls, swooping down the moment controllers radioed vector in. It worked beautifully when radios held up, but static, jamming, or damage sets often left pilots circling helplessly while soldiers fought below. Their first major opportunity came on June 7th, when the 12th SS Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion attempted to push west of Caen. Squadron leader Chris Voss of No. 198 Squadron received the call while leading 8 Typhoons on patrol. From 8,000 feet, he spotted a German column, 20 armored vehicles creeping along a tree-lined road, smoke rising against the pale morning sky. Voss led the attack straight through light flak, ordering each pilot to pick a target. 32 rockets streaked downward in 4 seconds. 8 found their mark, destroying 4 Panzer IVs and 3 half-tracks. The survivors scattered, their advance broken. That engagement set the pattern for the weeks ahead. The Typhoon had become the hammer against which German armor shattered. On the ground, the Wehrmacht still fought with skill and ferocity. Their tanks outgunned the Allies. Their infantry held every hedgerow with fanatical resolve. But daylight became their enemy. To move was to die. Panzer commanders faced an impossible choice: mass their forces and invite annihilation, or disperse and lose the firepower needed to break Allied lines. The hedgerows of Normandy had turned into a killing ground, ruled not by tanks, but by the once despised Typhoon. Then came Operation Goodwood, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's grand gamble. At dawn on July 18, 1944, 3 British armored divisions, some 750 tanks, surged forward east of Caen. The objective: seize Borgebus Ridge and split the German defenses. Montgomery promised Eisenhower a decisive blow. What followed was one of the most intense displays of air-ground coordination the war had ever seen, and the Typhoon was its spearhead. The assault began at 5:45 with over 2,000 heavy bombers saturating German positions. As the dust settled, Typhoons waited at forward airfields, engines roaring, rockets loaded, eyes fixed on the horizon. Within 2 hours, the German counterattack arrived. 3 Panzer divisions, the 1st SS, 12th SS, and 21st Panzer, converging to crush the British breakthrough. Nearly 300 tanks, including 75 Panthers and 30 Tigers, rolled toward the gap. If they reached the front intact, Montgomery's offensive would be obliterated. From a forward command post, Wing Commander Charles Green directed the Typhoon response through direct radio links with headquarters. Ultra decrypts and reconnaissance flights fed him live updates of German troop movements. At 8:20, photos revealed the 1st SS Panzer Division forming up near Sintos, just 8 miles south of the front. Within 6 minutes, 16 Typhoons from numbers 164 and 183 squadrons were airborne. Squadron leader John Ray led the first strike, spotting 40 vehicles, Panthers, half-tracks, and supply trucks, scattered across open farmland, guarded by quad 20mm flak guns. Ray's plan was brutal and brilliant. The formation split into 4 flights, each attacking from a different direction, forcing the Germans to divide their fire. As the first section drew the flak's attention, the others dived unopposed. 6-4 rockets screamed downward, bracketing the German column in thunderous explosions. Reconnaissance photos later showed 12 vehicles destroyed outright and 8 more crippled. The attacks didn't stop. All through July 18th, every time German armor tried to regroup, Typhoons arrived within 30 minutes to obliterate them. Near Bretteville-sur-Lys, 24 Typhoons from numbers 181, 182, and 247 squadrons descended like avenging angels, unleashing another storm of rockets. By nightfall, the fields of Normandy were strewn with blackened steel, the wreckage of Germany's pride and Britain's redemption. The Typhoon, once branded a failure, had finally come of age. The Typhoon's final triumph. The 12th SS Panzer Division's regiment had been caught in daylight, moving recklessly despite orders to avoid the skies. Convinced that speed could outweigh exposure, they raced toward the front, straight into ruin. 9-6 rockets rained down in 12 relentless minutes, tearing a 5-mile scar of burning wreckage across the landscape. What had been a column of armor became a funeral procession of flame. SS Obersturmbannführer Rudolf von Ribbentrop, commander of the 12th SS Reconnaissance Battalion, radioed that his unit had been annihilated from the air, suffering more than 60% losses. General Heinrich Eberbach of Panzer Group West warned Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge that daylight movements had become suicidal. Entire divisions were being picked apart before even reaching the battlefield. By the evening of July 20th, with Operation Goodwood drawing to its bloody close, Typhoon squadrons had flown 294 sorties and unleashed over 2,000 rockets. Intelligence officers tallied claims of some 400 German tanks and armored vehicles destroyed or disabled in 3 days, a figure so staggering that even the RAF's own analysts demanded proof. Within days, the Operational Research Section dispatched survey teams to the wreck-strewn fields of Normandy. Armed with clipboards and cameras, they combed the battle sites, cataloging every destroyed or abandoned vehicle and identifying weapon signatures. Rocket hits left unmistakable signs, gaping holes punched through thin armor, blackened paint radiating outward, and blasted interiors where warheads had detonated. Artillery kills looked different, clusters of smaller punctures or catastrophic hits from heavy shells. Tank-to-tank duels left clean penetrations in frontal plates at flat angles. Their findings were sobering. Of 257 wrecks examined, only 87, around 34%, bore clear evidence of rocket strikes. 93 had been destroyed by artillery, 41 by anti-tank guns, and the rest by mixed fire or self-destruction. The gap between pilot claims and field data reflected the chaos of air-ground combat. Diving at 300 miles per hour under flak, pilots saw smoke, flashes, and explosions, but rarely the truth. A single burning truck could look like a tank brewed up, and secondary detonations misled even the sharpest eyes. Squadron leader Dennis Gillum, now commanding 146th Wing, explained it bluntly. When you pull out of a dive with tracer flying past your canopy and see a bloody great explosion where your rockets hit, you think you've done for the bastard. Only later you find 6 other blokes at the same target, or it was a lorry full of fuel drums. Every Air Force suffered the same inflation. It was human, inevitable. Still, statistics could not erase the Typhoon's strategic victory. Rocket attacks had paralyzed German mobility, forcing panzers to disperse and choke the very roads they needed. Psychological damage compounded the physical. Captured tank crews spoke of pure terror, the rising growl of the Sabre engine. Commanders shut their hatches, crawled forward blind, and disobeyed orders to move by day. The Falaise pocket in mid-August turned this fear into apocalypse. As remnants of the 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army tried to escape through the narrowing gap, Typhoon squadrons hunted them for 6 straight days. The Chamboy-Tron Road became a charnel ground. Aerial photos from August 21st showed 7 miles of wreckage, over 500 vehicles, thousands of horses, and the corpses of men who had fled their machines. IAF pilots grimly called it the killing ground. Post-war German record confirmed the devastation. Panzer Group West lost 347 tanks and assault guns in July alone, roughly a third to air attack. The exact count mattered less than the effect. German armored warfare, the art of speed, shock, and concentration, was dead. The Typhoon had stripped the panzers of their essence, turning them into fragmented, immobile targets. The cab rank system born over Normandy revolutionized air support forever. Typhoons orbited between 8,000 and 10,000 feet, in constant contact with forward air controllers embedded with frontline units. A single radio call could summon 4 fighters within minutes. Group Captain Desmond Scott refined the process while leading 123 Wing. He introduced color-coded smoke shells, red for enemy targets, yellow for friendly lines. Artillery marked the position seconds before the Typhoons dived, allowing pilots to orient instantly and slashing the risk of friendly fire. The entire system relied on fewer than 40 IAF officers who served as forward controllers across the 2nd Tactical Air Force, men whose cool judgment linked infantry under fire to the sky's deadliest weapon. Britain's most troublesome fighter had ended the war as its most feared. From the fields of Normandy to the Falaise pocket, the Typhoon had carved a legend in smoke and flame, proof that even a failed machine, reborn through necessity, could change the fate of armies. The price of victory. Forward air controllers, those unseen anchors of the cab rank system, worked from armored vehicles bristling with radios, moving with the tank spearheads they served. Flight Lieutenant Donald Heatherto earned a military cross after enduring 12 hours under German shellfire near Falaise, calmly directing Typhoon strikes against counterattacking Panzers while explosions shook his truck. That day alone, he guided 18 separate missions, updating coordinates as the battlefield shifted and German armor probed for cracks in the British line. The system's speed proved decisive during the battle for Hill 112 in late June. The British 43rd Division had seized a ridge southwest of Corinth, only to face furious counterblows from the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions. Captain Jimmy Woods, the forward air controller attached to divisional headquarters, was on the radio almost constantly on the 29th of June, summoning Typhoons every 20 or 30 minutes as waves of German tanks climbed the slopes. He vectored aircraft onto targets sometimes only 400 yards from British foxholes. Each strike smashed assaults before they gathered strength, allowing exhausted infantry to hold ground that would have been lost without air power. German tactics evolved under the Typhoon's relentless presence. Panzer commanders began using morning fog for concealment and dispersing their tanks singly rather than in columns, sacrificing communication for survival. Some employed decoys, wrecked vehicles left in the open to lure attacks while serviceable armor hid beneath trees. These ruses brought short reprieves but solved nothing. The Wehrmacht in France now lived under the unblinking eyes of Allied pilots. Concentration or daylight movement meant destruction. By September 1944, the figures told a story. 2nd Tactical Air Force records showed that 83% of Typhoon sorties in Normandy followed cab rank procedures instead of pre-planned strikes. Average response time from target sighting to rocket delivery had fallen from 90 minutes in June to less than 15 minutes by August. Ground commanders trusted the system so completely that they built it into their battle plans, advancing along routes that deliberately exposed German defenses because Typhoon support could suppress strong points faster than artillery. The Germans coined grim slang for their brief reprieves, jabot-fry periods, fleeting hours of safety when weather or darkness grounded the fighter bombers. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, wounded by a Typhoon attack on the 17th of July, warned Berlin that Allied air supremacy had made mobile warfare impossible. He was right. The cab rank system had not merely provided support, it had rewritten the rules of ground combat, rendering Germany's blitzkrieg doctrine obsolete. For the Typhoon pilots, this war demanded a different breed of courage. It was not the quick reflex bravery of dogfights, but the deliberate resolve to dive again and again into a storm of invisible death. Flying at 2,000 feet put them within range of every German weapon, from rifles to the dreaded 88mm gun. Unlike bomber crews who could see flak bursts and jink away, Typhoon pilots committed to attack runs with no exit. Pulling up early meant failure. Pressing on meant threading a tunnel of fire. Losses were brutal. In June and July 1944 alone, ground fire destroyed 151 Typhoons, an average of 2.5 per day, and 247 more returned riddled with damage, from patched holes to ruined engines. Pilot casualties reached 23% in 8 weeks, a 1 in 5 chance of death or maiming for anyone completing the standard 5th sortie tour. The attrition rivaled, and in some weeks exceeded, Bomber Command's losses, yet went largely unnoticed because low-level fighter operations lacked the spectacle of thousand-plane raids. Flight Lieutenant Pierre Klosterman captured the terror in his memoir. You dive at 400 miles an hour, tracer rising lazily until it whips past the wings like fiery lashes. You can see the Germans at their guns, actually tracking you. Then the world becomes orange tracer and black bursts, and you hold the dive because to pull up is to waste everything. The psychological toll mounted. Volunteers who had once begged for Typhoon postings began to dread each briefing, aware that any sortie might be their last. The 88mm gun was their executioner of choice, its 21-pound shell traveling at 2,690 feet per second, fast enough to reach an attacking fighter before the pilot could react. German batteries placed the guns to overlap fields of fire, creating invisible kill zones. A direct hit didn't cripple a Typhoon, it erased it. Squadron leader Derek Walker watched his wingman, Flying Officer Colin McKee, take such a hit in the Argentine. May's aircraft exploded. No parachute. Nothing could have survived. Experience offered no protection. Flight Lieutenant John Baldwin, the pioneer of rocket tactics in 1943, died on the 19th of July when fragments from his own rockets tore through his engine and ignited the fuel. Trapped by a warped canopy, he struggled to escape as his aircraft rolled over and plunged burning into the forest below. Wing Commander John Ray, one of the Typhoon Force's most seasoned officers, was shot down 3 times, twice in Normandy and once in Holland, and each time returned to fly again. Amid the losses, gallows humor kept despair at bay. Squadrons ran dead pools, betting who would be next to go down. Noah's Ark grew darker. Skulls, coffins, grim jokes daubed over olive paint. Evenings in the mess blurred into heavy drinking, part camaraderie, part anesthesia. Commanders watched for cracks in their men, the hesitations in briefings, the trembling hands of those who knew they were living on borrowed hours. The Typhoon War was as much a battle of nerves as of engines and rockets, and only the toughest mind survived its furnace. The Typhoon's redemption. Some pilots' hands trembled as they signed the authorization book before each mission. Those showing such strain were quietly transferred to non-combat duties, their nerves beyond repair. Yet the squadrons kept flying. Replacement pilots arrived straight from training units and learned fast in the crucible of battle, attack boldly, release weapons at the right range no matter how fierce the flak, and trust your wingman to cover you while you aimed. Determination and command pressure sustained the Typhoon force, which the IAF now considered as vital as Bomber Command's offensive or the defense of Britain's skies. The price was staggering, but it brought tangible progress on the ground. German armies fell back eastward under the constant shriek of rockets. The Typhoon's metamorphosis, from lethal failure to indispensable weapon, mirrored Britain's broader wartime story: adaptation under pressure, improvisation over rigid doctrine, and the will to make flawed machines succeed. No aircraft embodied that spirit more vividly. What had begun in 1941 as a disaster ended 3 years later as a revolution in air-ground warfare. The final reckoning told the tale in numbers as well as legend. Between D-Day and Germany's surrender in May 1945, Typhoon squadrons flew more than 36,000 combat sorties, fired roughly 60,000 rockets, and expended 150 million cannon shells. They destroyed or crippled thousands of vehicles, bridges, locomotives, and bunkers from France to the Low Countries and deep into Germany. More than statistics, they achieved paralysis. The Wehrmacht could no longer move by day. Forced into static defenses, German formations became easy prey for Allied material superiority. Victory came at a harrowing cost. In the last 2 years of the war, 672 Typhoons were lost, nearly one-third of all built. Over 1,000 pilots were killed or went missing, hundreds more maimed beyond further service. These deaths seldom came in glamorous dogfights, but in relentless strikes against unseen gunners hidden in hedgerows. The Typhoon force earned far less public glory than the bomber fleets or the celebrated Battle of Britain Aces, yet its role in freeing Western Europe was equally decisive. Post-war reviews vindicated those who had refused to scrap the aircraft during its nightmare debut. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, later Eisenhower's deputy, wrote that Allied tactical air supremacy shortened the war by months, perhaps years, and credited the Typhoon above all for preventing German armored counteroffensives after Normandy. Whenever the Wehrmacht tried to mass tanks for a decisive blow, rocket-armed fighters tore the formations apart before they could strike. The arithmetic was brutal but clear. Better to lose young pilots than prolong the war and cost thousands more lives on the ground. The Typhoon's true legacy reached far beyond its wreckage. It proved that air power could shape battles directly and instantaneously, not merely by bombing cities from afar. That insight reshaped post-war doctrine across NATO, inspiring the creation of dedicated close-support aircraft and advanced forward control systems, all descendants of the cab-rank experiments over Normandy. Modern precision strike aviation owes its existence to the lessons bought with Typhoon pilots' blood. Individual stories gave those lessons a human face. Roland Beaumont survived the war with 2 distinguished service orders and multiple distinguished flying crosses, later testing Hawker's next generation of jets and helping Britain break the sound barrier. Pierre Closterman, whose memoir captured the fury of low-level combat, ended the war with 33 victories and flew until age 74. Desmond Scott, the New Zealander who perfected cab-rank tactics, retired as an Air Commodore after commanding IAF Germany. Yet for every name remembered, dozens more lie in Commonwealth graves across Europe, faces fading in photographs, their courage recorded only in squadron logs. The Typhoon itself vanished quickly into history. Within a year of victory, jets like the Meteor rendered piston fighters obsolete. The last Typhoon squadron disbanded in 1946, its aircraft scrapped or sold abroad for token sums. Only a handful survive in museums today, their scarred metal a testament to Britain's improvisation at its most desperate hour. Those remaining A-frames tell a single, extraordinary story of a fighter so flawed it nearly doomed its own pilots, yet so vital it helped destroy Hitler's armies. The Typhoon's redemption was bought with courage, ingenuity, and blood, etched forever into Normandy's soil in trails of smoke and flame. Britain's worst fighter had become exactly what the war required, precisely when it mattered most.